But I did want to begin there because I say that in presenting my brief, I am mindful and respectful of the evidence that we're given to this tribunal by others, and particularly those who have suffered abuse while in state or church-administered institutions. I acknowledge and honour their evidence. They are the proper commentators on this kaupapa, and I only hope that this brief may give some context to their words and some explanation of the ways in which successive governments have failed them. The brief has 5 parts, and because I'm mindful of the time, I'll try and condense different parts as well, but I'm happy to answer questions on any part of the brief. So part 1, he whakamarama, is just an explanation, and I'd like to pick up from paragraph 16. Over the last 4 years, I've been involved in research on the relationship between Māori and the criminal justice system. The research is an update of the 1988 report on the same issue, He Whai Pānga Hou. It's been conducted with 2 young researchers, Ngāwai McGregor and Anne Wapu, and the new report will be published early next year. The research has been distressing because of the stories of hurt that have been shared by mokopuna who have done harm and those who have been harmed. That harm has included abuse in care. The research has also been distressing because so little has changed. As the Commission will know, Māori men make up 52% of the prison population, as they did at the time of He Whai Pānga Hou in the 1980s. Māori women, however, now make up nearly 64% of the female prison population, when on average they were less than half that number in the 1980s. That is an especially shameful statistic. The research involved hui and interviews with over 6,000 Māori people, including 600 Māori men and women who are or were in prison. Of those 600 current or former inmates, over half were placed in state or church care as children, and over half of them were abused in care. I would also like to add that among those 600 were 44 who identified as takatapui, as gay or transgender. Over half of those were also placed in care, and all of those takatapui were abused in care as children. Their treatment or mistreatment in care was part of their almost inevitable progression into prison. Many of them are still comparatively young and suffered abuse in institutions after 1999. It was a matter of concern that they may not have had the opportunity to tell their stories to this Commission. It is my earnest hope that the Commission will exercise its discretion in a helpful way to address the abuse suffered by those victims. The abuse which our research uncovered and the ensuing trauma which the victims have suffered did not only make the work personally difficult, it also compelled us to look at causative and systemic factors in a quite different way to that which was adopted in He Whai Pānga Hou and indeed in most other criminological research. An important part of that difference has been shaped by the fact that the research for the first time includes a comparative analysis of the incarceration of other Indigenous peoples in Canada, the United States and Australia. The high incarceration rates in those countries are similar to the rates in this country. What is also disturbingly similar is that all 4 countries have followed the same trajectory of colonisation and have employed similar ideologies and practices. The comparable injustice of the current rates of Indigenous carceration, in our view, flows from those colonising similarities which prompted a quite specific research question: why do states with a history of colonisation imprison so many Indigenous peoples? It became clear in the course of the research that such a question was not only appropriate but necessary. Indeed, there seemed to be clear symmetries between the injustice of colonisation and the injustice of disproportionate Indigenous incarceration, which was system-based rather than offender-specific. It is my considered view that the abuse of Māori children in care also arises from the same context, as indeed does the abuse of all children. Colonisation is an inherently abusive process. I accept with considerable sadness that many of those who will speak to this Commission about abuse will be Māori. For some time now, the statistics about Māori overrepresentation in negative social and economic spheres has been regularly and publicly cited. If I'd move to paragraph 27, however, while the overrepresentation may be known, there seems less understanding about why Māori are so overrepresented. Some governments have appeared eager to invest in programs targeting Māori outcomes, but have been less willing to properly consider the reasons for the disproportionality. And if I can just interpolate here, that is why it was important to us to make those comparisons with Canada, Australia, and the United States. I believe that this Royal Commission offers an opportunity for New Zealand to grapple with those reasons. In my considered view, they are unavoidably linked to the history of colonisation and the failure of successive governments to honour Te Tiriti or Waitangi. To honestly consider the issue in this way is to necessarily consider how colonisation evolved as a transnational process of dispossession that has had destructive effects on Indigenous peoples throughout the world. An interrogation of its systemically violent and racist nature helps position the recent and current abuse of Māori children, and indeed all children, in a context where understanding and eventual resolution might be achieved. And my friend Rawiri and Alison also alluded to some of that history. But I'd submit that reckoning with colonisation and acknowledging the constitutional implications of that reckoning will help better develop policies to care for children and vulnerable people. That will require a certain courage, which I hope the Commission will feel able to express. I know that the Commission is aware of the work already done in other jurisdictions to consider related issues, such as the Australian inquiry into stolen generations and the Canadian inquiry into residential schools. However, I'd like to quote from the executive summary of the Canadian inquiry's report, as it provides the transnational colonising context referred to earlier and illustrates the harsh complexity of the issue. And to quote, Canada's residential school system for Aboriginal children was an education system in name only for much of its existence. These residential schools were created for the purpose of separating Aboriginal children from their families in order to minimise and weaken family ties and cultural linkages, and to indoctrinate children into a new culture, the culture of the legally dominant Euro-Christian Canadian society, led by Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. The Commission heard from more than 6,000 witnesses, most of whom survived the experience of living in the schools as students. The stories of that experience are sometimes difficult to accept as something that could have happened in a country such as Canada, which has long prided itself on being a bastion of democracy, peace, and kindness throughout the world. Children were abused physically and sexually, and they died in the schools in numbers that would not have been tolerated in any school system anywhere in the country or in the world. Getting to the truth was hard, but getting to reconciliation will be harder. It requires that the paternalistic and racist foundations of the residential school system be rejected as the basis for an ongoing relationship. Reconciliation requires that a new vision based on commitment to mutual respect be developed. It also requires an understanding that the most harmful impacts of residential schools have been the loss in self-respect of Aboriginal people and the lack of respect that non-Aboriginal peoples have been raised to have for their Aboriginal neighbours. Reconciliation is not an Aboriginal problem, it is a Canadian one. Virtually all aspects of Canadian society may need to be reconsidered. I believe that the observations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are relevant to the work of this Commission. Although the experience in this country has been different in many ways, the intent and indeed the underlying and purposeful ideologies of colonisation have been the same. It is that belief which most guides this brief. The context of colonisation. I understand that many others who will speak to the Commission will address the issue of colonisation. I would like to focus specifically on its ideologies as well as its effects, and will discuss how the issues before the Commission are inevitably framed by its violent history in this country. Words like colonisation, like colonialism and colonisation, are contested and often misunderstood. However, in simple terms, colonisation has always been a process in which people are dispossessed of their lands, lives and power. It is an inherently brutal process that has been defined by the United Nations as a crime against humanity. In this country, there has unfortunately been a historical reluctance to acknowledge either its true nature or the costs that it has exacted upon Māori. That situation has changed somewhat in recent years, but there is still considerable unawareness of its history and the ideologies which underpinned its development prior to 1840. Yet it is that history which provides context for both the general status of iwi and hapu today, and for the particular antecedents that have shaped the issues before this Commission. It is also, of course, the context within which the text of Te Tiriti o Waitangi was signed. It is not possible to give a detailed chronology of colonisation of the world's Indigenous peoples that has occurred since the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Americas in 1492. However, the dispossession of Māori is part of that wider transnational history, and in my view, cannot be understood without some recognition of the forces and ideas which preceded it in the dispossession of Indigenous peoples in the Americas and Australia. Those historical forces are the whakapapa explaining the colonisation of Māori. They were developed through centuries of European discourse about the status and even the humanity of Indigenous peoples. Indeed, the development of racism as an ideology and the assumption that some peoples were inferior and could therefore be dispossessed by more superior races evolved contemporaneously with colonisation. One of the most influential colonising discourses derives from a series of canon law debates conveyed by the King of Spain in Valladolid in 1515. The purpose of the debates was to determine firstly whether Indigenous peoples were fully human, and secondly, whether they could be dispossessed in terms of the debate remit without damage to our conscience and in accord with justice and reason. The prevailing view at the debates was that Indigenous peoples were in fact human, although not so fully human, they could not be dispossessed, provided it was done, to quote again, with kindness and gentle usage. It was essentially a race-based conclusion, and there is a certain contradiction in terms in the assumption that people could be dispossessed with kindness. Certainly the assumption was abused in the centuries that followed. Yet the idea that colonisation could somehow be humane and benevolent was adopted by the British humanitarian movement that became influential in the formulation of colonial policy in the 19th century. It led in turn to the notions of Crown good faith and the honour of the Crown, which have marked the dominant narratives about colonisation in this country. It has also led to the equally misleading presumption that colonisation was consequently somehow better here than elsewhere. It is that presumption, perhaps more than any other, which has underscored the reluctance to honestly discuss colonisation as both a history and an ongoing reality. Colonisation has, of course, occurred in different ways in different places, but the ideas behind it have always remained the same. So too have all the costs for Indigenous peoples, because its very taking has always been destructive and traumatic. In this country, the misremembering of colonisation as somehow better has led to an abstraction of those costs, which distorts their true and ongoing nature. For taking away the land from people who live as people of the land is not simply some passing land loss. It is an ongoing rupture that fractures the essential spiritual and practical ties to identity and belonging. A people cannot be tangata whenua if they have no whenua to be tangata upon. Taking people's lives and the simple tragedy of loss induces a collective intergenerational grief that compounds the trauma of the other takings. In such circumstances, the possibility of maintaining a nurturing sense of cultural integrity and collective strength is necessarily diminished. Each taking merges historically in colonisation's ultimate goal, which is to assume power and impose legal and political institutions in places which already have their own. It means subordinating the power of iwi and hapu mana and tino rangatiratanga, or self-determination, and thus limiting the ability to properly protect what are the most important taonga for any people, the land, the culture, and the mokopuna. In that context, the taking of Māori children has been a cost that has been both intensely personal and inherently political. The presumed right to do so was derived from the same racist presumptions of European superiority that marked colonisation as a whole, and the attendant belief that Indigenous children needed to be saved, civilised, and protected from themselves. Indeed, the ethos of saving and protecting was a key part of the humanitarian ideology. Its precedents were established in the dialectics developed after the Waitangi debates and given practical transnational effect, for example, in the process of uplifting and placing Indigenous children in residential schools in the United States and Canada that was referred to earlier. A brief examination of the policy may be helpful to the Commission, One of its earliest proponents in the United States and the director of the first residential school was Richard H. Pratt, who outlined his philosophical intent in a paper at the 19th Annual Conference of Charities and Correction, in which he said, to quote, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." The aim then was to take the Indianness out of the children in order that they might be successfully assimilated into the superior European civilization. In many ways, the policy simply reflects the abusiveness that is systemic in colonisation as a process. The consequent sexual, physical and spiritual abuse that was consequently suffered by the thousands of Indigenous children in the schools was simply a dreadful manifestation of that inherent violence. It was not due just to some individual perversity, but was an inevitable and accepted expression of colonisation's purpose. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission referred to above described that purpose and the practice as cultural genocide. And to quote again from their report, "Cultural genocide is the destruction of those structures and practices that allow the group to continue as a group. States that engage in cultural genocide set out to destroy the political and social institutions of the targeted group. Land is seized and populations are forcibly transferred and their movement is restricted. Languages are banned, spiritual leaders are persecuted, spiritual practices are forbidden, and objects of spiritual value are confiscated and destroyed. And most significantly to the issue at hand, families are disrupted to prevent the transmission of cultural values and identity from one generation to the next. In dealing with Aboriginal people, Canada did all of these things. Colonising governments in this country never established residential schools, but they shared the same assimilative intentions. They also assumed the same authority to take Māori children from their whānau. Their actions, as pertinent to this inquiry, may equally and properly be described as cultural genocide. Again, it is not possible in this brief to canvass all of the history which may fit within the definition of cultural genocide adopted by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. However, some indicative examples may be listed using the component parts of its terminology, and I'm sure the Commission is aware of many more. And so, the first point which they raised, that land is seized, populations are forcibly transferred, and their movement is restricted. The wars which Dr. Waitangi Karina referred to, the various Native Lands Acts and several dozen land acquisition statutes, the assault on Parihaka, Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei and Bastion Point, and at this moment Ihumātao, are examples of that first component of cultural genocide. Languages are banned. The Native Schools Act 1867, the stories of those like Puti Puti Onekawa, also referred to in the evidence of Dr. Waitangi Karina. Spiritual leaders are persecuted, te whiti o runga mai and tuhu kākahi, te kōtiriki ārikirangi, rua kenana. Spiritual practices are forbidden, the Tohunga Suppression Act. Objects of spiritual value are confiscated. The taong and wharenui now housed overseas. The scorched earth policy which saw whare and kāinga raised in Tūhoi and other rohe. And most significantly to the issues before this commission, families are disrupted to prevent the transmission of cultural values and identity from one generation to the next. Closed adoptions is referenced in the statement of Allison. Social welfare and justice, youth justice facilities such as Kohi Tere, E Puni and others, and the disproportionate taking of Māori babies. To paraphrase the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in its dealings with Māori, New Zealand did all these things. It is therefore my submission that while the implementation of colonisation may have differed in some ways in this country, it has not been better. The intention to take has been the same as in other countries, and dispossession is dispossession, even when it is carried out with an allegedly honourable intent or kind usage. Colonisation has always been genocidal, and the assumption of a power to take Māori children has been part of that destructive intent. The taking itself is an abuse. Part 3, Tikanga and Te Tiriti o Waitangi. I acknowledge that the Commission is not mandated to be a deliberative body on Te Tiriti o Waitangi. However, Te Taumata o Kahungunu, which I am a part, has long held the view that the authority assumed by the Crown to remove Māori children from their whānau is not consistent with Te Tiriti. This view was supported at the hui called by the Whānau Order Commissioning Agency earlier this year to establish an independent Māori review of current oranga tamariki policies. A member of the governing body for the review, Dame Nada Glavish, stated, "Our tūpuna did not sign Te Tiriti giving permission for the Crown to take our tamariki." For that reason, I hope it might be helpful for the Commission to briefly canvass the consistent Māori understanding of Te Tiriti, as it indicates the grounds upon which the taking and abuse of Māori children is regarded as a breach of Te Tiriti. It also presages the suggested resolutions outlined later in this brief. And I'll try to paraphrase the next few paragraphs, if that's all right for the Commission. History shows that every society realises very early on that it cannot survive in a lawless state. They therefore establish ways of ensuring social cohesion and harmony by developing a philosophy or jurisprudence of law, as well as a discrete legal system to give effect to it. And in paragraph 61, iwi and hapu long ago developed a law or tikanga that grew out of the stories and culture that developed in this land. It developed from philosophies to do with the sacred interrelatedness of whakapapa, as well as from precedents and customs devised by the tipuna. It recognised the need for sanctions, but stressed the ethical base of any behaviour and sought reconciliation rather than punishment. It recognised the relationships between people and every part of the universe, both seen and unseen, physical and spiritual. Perhaps the clearest example of the efficacy of tikanga as law, as seen in the ceremonies that were performed when a baby was born. The rites of birth, R-I-T-E-S, the rites of birth associated with naming and blessing the child, were not just a cultural celebration, but a legal affirmation of the rights or entitlements that would vest in the child as he or she grew into adulthood. They established the child's tūranga waiwai and the interests on title and land that went with his or her whakapapa. At the same time, they were a public declaration of the collector's obligation to care for and protect the child. It may be helpful to refer the Commission, although that's not mentioned in the brief, to the Native Land Act of 1867 and subsequent regulations, which actually initiated policy moves to ban Māori childbirth ceremonies, and particularly the burying of the afterbirth or whenua in the whenua of the child. Paragraph 63, tikanga as law itself was thus relational as well as values-based. It was bound by the ethics of what ought to be in a relationship, as well as the values that measured the tapu and mana of individuals and the collective. Paragraph 64, as in all cultures, law was symbiotic with the exercise of political power. The effective exercise of mana or tino rangatiratanga was proscribed and prescribed by tikanga, which in turn was given efficacy by the mana of the iwi and hapu. The concept of mana as a political and constitutional power denoted an absolute authority, and it was made up of what may be called the specifics of power. A, the power to protect, that is the power to protect manaki and be the kaitiaki for everything and everyone within the polity. B, a power to define, that is the power to define what should be protected and the power to define the rights, interest and place of individuals and collectives. C, a power to decide, that is the power to make decisions about everything affecting the well-being of the people. And D, a power to develop, that is the power to change to meet new circumstances in ways that are consistent with tikanga and conducive to the advancement of the people. But if iwi and hapu were independent, they were also necessarily interdependent through whakapapa. The mana of one polity was necessarily connected to the mana of another, in the same way that individuals were interdependent and the mana of humans was inseparable from mana whenua, mana moana and mana atua. Within this reality, two fundamental tenets underpinned mana and tino rangatiratanga and determined how they could be exercised. Firstly, the power was bound by law and could only be exercised in ways consistent with tikanga and thus the maintenance of relationships and responsibilities. Secondly, the power was held by and for the people. That is, it was a taonga handed down from the tipuna to be exercised by the living for the benefit of the mokopuna. The ramifications of those prescriptions was that mana was absolutely inalienable. No matter how powerful rangatira might presume to be, they never possessed the authority nor had the right to give away or subordinate the mana of the collective, because to do so would have been to give away the whakapapa and the responsibilities bequeathed by the tipuna. It would have been to abdicate the responsibility to protect the people and the land. To hold mana and tino rangatiratanga was the only way in tikanga terms to hold the mana of every child acknowledged in the rites of birth. The fact that there is no word in Te Reo Māori for seed, C-E-D-E, is not a linguistic shortcoming, but an indication that to even contemplate seeding or giving away mana would have been legally impossible, politically untenable, and culturally incomprehensible. It was those legal and political understandings which naturally guided the process of treaty making. For like all polities, iwi and hapu have a long history of negotiating treaties with each other. It predates Te Tiriti o Waitangi and was known in Ngāti Kahungunu as Te Mahi Tūhono, or the work to bring people together. Like tikanga as law, treating was a relational process dependent upon mana and the notion of equitable interdependence. The important question in situating Te Tiriti in the Māori reality, therefore, is not whether rangatira understood sovereignty, a preoccupation of many Pākehā historians and jurists, but whether they understood mana. Sovereignty, after all, was a foreign concept of power, and because evidence shows that all of the understandings reached by the rangatira in relation to Te Tiriti were concluded in te reo, rather than a foreign language, the key interpretive lens was obviously mana and tino rangatiratanga, with all of their implications and absoluteness. The evidence in iwi histories in te reo before and at the time of the signing clearly indicates that rangatira were mindful of their responsibility to preserve and even enhance the mana they were entrusted with. In 1840, they could only act according to tikanga and commit the people to a relationship that was tika in terms of their constitutional traditions. The constant statements in those history that the words in Te Tiriti do not envisage or permit a cession of mana or even a recognition of some sort of overarching Crown authority, therefore reaffirm a fundamental Māori truth. They simply could not consent to something that was not only contrary to law, but also the very base upon which iwi and hapu society was built. That truth points to an obvious Māori meaning to Te Tiriti, which the Waitangi Tribunal reaffirmed in its first stage report on the Paparahi o Te Raki claim, he whakaputanga me Te Tiriti. In its report, the Tribunal declared that Māori did not cede sovereignty to the Crown, but rather sought the recognition of what the Tribunal has called different spheres of influence. They retained mana and tino rangatiratanga because that was the prerequisite to any equitable relationship. The tikanga understanding of Te Tiriti as affirmed by the Tribunal may be illustrated with an analogy. For just as part of the responsibility of mana was to recognise relationships with others and to expect that they would reciprocate by ensuring that their people did nothing to impinge upon one's own harmony and well-being, so rangatira actively sought a relationship with the Crown through Te Tiriti and granted it a limited power, kāwanatanga, to ensure its people did not impinge upon the mana of iwi and hapu. Māori linguists have explained the nuances of the words in Te Tiriti, but the legal and political realities of iwi and hapu give those nuances a specific meaning. If mana was not ceded, then Te Tiriti was a Māori reaffirmation of a tikanga-based expectation that iwi and hapu would continue to have the authority to protect their mokopuna. The subsequent usurpation of that authority by the Crown may, in my view, consequently be seen as a breach of Te Tiriti. The fact that such a tikanga-based understanding has been dismissed in the colonising history since 1840 does not invalidate it. Rather, it merely indicates the steps this country still needs to take to properly honour Te Tiriti. It also indicates that there is already a Te Tiriti-based framework in place that could justly provide both a measure to assess the wrongs of the abuse and care and a way to prevent such harm in the future. Part 4, Puao Te Atatu and its aftermath. And because this has been covered in some detail already, I would like to refer the Commission to paragraph 80. After Puao Te Atatu was released, a Māori resource group was established. Among its deliberations was a consideration of the prevailing convention of the time that the Director General of Social Welfare was the guardian of children in care in New Zealand. The resource group suggested that if those children were Māori, then the proper tiriti and whakapapa-based guardian was the iwi, hapu and whānau. The suggestion was never acted upon, but it was a genuine attempt to give effect to the power to protect mokopuna, which was reaffirmed in Te Tiriti. It also presaged the Waitangi Tribunal finding that Te Tiriti envisaged different spheres of influence and the logical tikanga assertion that the care and protection of mokopuna was inherently a Māori sphere of influence. It is my considered view that the failure of the Crown to acknowledge that power to protect vesting in iwi, hapu and whānau is a continuation of the denial of what Te Tiriti actually means. It is part of an ongoing colonising dialectic which is not ameliorated by the recent moves by Oranga Tamariki to establish relationship agreements with iwi. While those agreements are a positive initiative entered into by iwi and officials of Oranga Tamariki with good intent, they do not address the power imbalances in the current iteration of treaty partnerships. Neither do they address the systemic and historical issues which led to the uplift and abuse of Māori children. That kind of transformational change will only come with a meaningful honouring of Te Tiriti and a different constitutional arrangement between the Crown and iwi and hapu. And so the final part of my brief, constitutional transformation and the care of mokopuna. It may seem outside the terms of reference of this Commission to consider issues of constitutional transformation. However, it is my submission that the ultimate resolution of the issue of abuse and care, and of children in care in general, resides in returning the care and protection of mokopuna to iwi and hapu. That necessarily means something more than an iwi responsibility for care within parameters prescribed by the Crown. It ultimately requires a shift in the constitutional decision-making processes, which finally acknowledges that Māori have the right to self-determination in its fullest sense. Such a discourse is not a new one for Māori. As referred to earlier in the brief, it was the base of relationships envisaged in Te Tiriti in 1840. In subsequent years, it was the motivation for the establishment of the kotahitanga and kingitanga movements, as well as the establishment of the Māori Parliament in 1892. The discussion has not changed over the years because Māori people have always sought equitable and conciliatory arrangements with the Crown. that is consistent with tikanga, as well as necessary if the injustice of colonisation is to finally be remedied. To address that issue as part of a discussion about the care of all our mokopuna seems a good place to continue that dialogue. At a national hui of Māori in 2010, the issue is once again raised, which led to the Iwi Chairs Forum establishing a working group, Mā Tika Mai, to discuss the issue with Māori around the country. I was asked to convene the working group, and Professor Margaret Mutu was appointed its chair. The brief given to the working group was to hold discussions about a new constitutional framework based upon tikanga, the 1835 Declaration of Independence, he whakaputanga, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and relevant international human rights instruments. Over the next 5 years, the working group held 252 hui, and the associated rangatahi group organised 70 wānanga with young people. The report of the working group, He Whakaro Here Whakaumu Mo Aotearoa, was released on Waitangi Day in 2016. It is not appropriate to discuss its findings in detail before the Commission, but it may be helpful to outline the main tiriti-based values it identified as they are pertinent to the creation of a truly treaty-based society where all mokopuna may be safe and cared for. Although the values were discussed as prerequisites for constitutional transformation, they may also be seen as interrelated parts of a wider ethic of caring. The first is the value of place. That is the need to promote good relationships with and ensure the protection of papatuanuku, so that all who mokopuna might live with manaakitanga and aroha. The value of tikanga, that is the core ideals that describe the ought to be of living in Aotearoa and the particular place of Māori within that tikanga. The value of community, that is the need to facilitate good relationships between all peoples. The value of belonging, that is the need for everyone, and especially the young, to grow with a secure sense of belonging. The value of balance, that is the need to maintain harmony in all relationships in whānau and within the wider community. The value of conciliation, that is the need to guarantee a conciliatory and consensual democracy. Two major themes were identified at every hui and underpin the values outlined above. The first was that the land was a taonga that should be protected for all. The second was that mokopuna were also taonga who should be free to grow in a safe and loving whānau. The values and themes identified were then incorporated into different constitutional models based on the notion of different spheres of influence suggested by the Waitangi Tribunal. In each model, the care of mokopuna Māori was rightly placed in the tino rangatiratanga sphere of influence. It was acknowledged throughout the hui that in relation to the well-being of children, there were instances where for various reasons mokopuna might be unsafe. How it was also clearly expected that the authority to decide whether the child might need to be removed and other care provided was equally rightly a decision for iwi and hapu to make. It was also clearly recognised that any removal needed to be within the child's whakapapa and involve assistance for the whānau to address whatever social or economic issues it might have. The word rangatiratanga can literally be translated as weaving the people together. Ranga is to weave, tira is the group or people. And it is that sustaining and mending of relationships that has always been fundamental to the proper Māori care of Māori children. Those conclusions were part of the long struggle of iwi and hapu to have the treaty honoured and to at last address the injustice of colonisation. The historic abuse of mokopuna Māori is one of colonisation's most egregious wrongs. If this commission finds some way to offer solace to those who have been abused, that will be some measure of justice long overdue. If it frames that comfort in a willingness to systemically and constitutionally address the overarching injustice of colonisation, that will be a justice which offers hope for the future. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe. I wondered, just as one additional question, whether you had any comment around Section 7AA of Oranga Tamariki Act, which is a new provision. You've touched on it earlier in your evidence, but whether you wanted to elaborate on, in effect, whether that goes far enough against the kōrero that you've given us this afternoon.
If I could just preface my response by repeating a point I made in the brief, that iwi certainly, and I believe on the ground staff in Oranga Tamariki, have entered into those agreements with good intent. But they are systemically flawed because they do not address the power imbalances which exist. They retain the power of decision-making with the Crown and do not acknowledge the right inherent in tēnā rangatiratanga for iwi and hapu to make those decisions. The second part of my response is that the rhetoric currently used by the Crown is to establish relationships that are by and for Māori. And there is some value in that depiction of the relationship, but it is actually also inadequate, if I can draw what might seem a far-fetched analogy, but nevertheless true. When Abraham Lincoln gave his famous Gettysburg Address during the American Civil War, he spoke about the return of government of the people, for the people, by the people. The treaty does not require a relationship just for and by Māori. It requires a relationship of Māori, in which Māori have the power of making decisions. And that's the, if you like, philosophical shortcoming in the whole idea of relationships based by and for Māori.
Kia ora. I don't have any further questions, and I'm conscious that others might. So I'll just take this opportunity. Kei te kōtuku re rangatahi, te rangatira, tēnā te mihi nui I tō kōrero rangatira. Kia rangatira tēnei kaupapa I tēnei rā, ana reira tēnei te mihi ki a koe.
O he mihi ki a kōrua ko Julia, e tautoko nei e awhina I ahau I tēnei tuhi tui mo tēnei ripota, tēnā kōrua.
Kia ora.
Thank you. Are there any council who wish? Ms. Sykes?
Kei te tū au ki te tautoko I ngā mihi ko mihia kia koe e kia nei te tohunga I pupuri te Māori o tō tātou nei tiriti. E mihi maihoha tēnei ki a koutou o Ngāti Kahungunu Ngāti Porou. hei manaaki, hei aki a koe I runga I te whakaaro me whai tonu I tēnei reanga te mana motuhake mō tō tātou nei a treaty. I runga I taua tuahutanga e mihi whakatau tēnei. Ka huri atau ki tērā o ngā reo me patapātai he wāhanga poto engari he wāhanga nui e kia nei aha kohe iti he paunamu. I notice in your brief, which is carefully constructed, you've tried hard to limit the disclosures to yourself in the current project you're doing to events between perhaps 1989 and 1999 in the interviews that you conducted with people who have been in state care in that period. One of the matters that you don't elaborate on is, did you notice, as Ms. Green did, that the numbers of Māori really escalated in significant levels between the research that you'd done in 1988 and your current research? And I'd really like to focus on that period and the trends that you observed between 1988 and 1999.
The numbers of Māori men in prison has remained constant at around 52% for over 40 years. The sharp increase has been in the numbers of Māori women imprisoned, which coincides with the implementation of neoliberal policies, what I call the criminalisation of poverty. So a lot of Māori women who are in prison for crimes of poverty. And the rise of a rate in the 1980s of less than 10% of the female prison population being Māori to now being 64%, which in the research we've done per capita now makes Māori women the most imprisoned group of women in the world. But while that increase has been stark in the last 30 years, I think it's part of a longer trajectory as well, which is part of colonisation as well, because in the periods of the most assimilative pressure being placed on Māori people in the 19th century, a lot of that assimilative pressure was placed on Māori women and the role that Māori women played in Māori society. And so there was not only an attack on the integrity of whānau, there was a specific attack on the role of Māori women, which particularly infected the integrity of whānau, and the intergenerational effects have then played out. The intergenerational effects of that were exacerbated constantly by the criminal justice system being the enforcement arm of the Crown. But what happened from about the mid-1890s for the next 60-odd years was when Māori were classified at the end of the 19th century as a dying race, we retreated to those safe, largely rural areas that had not been confiscated. So there was little contact comparatively little contact between Māori and Pākehā people. And so the Māori imprisonment rate, which had soared during the wars, when Māori who resisted the confiscation of land were imprisoned, so there was a criminalisation of Māori resistance. So the prison rate rose, but then with the dying race and the retreat into rural safety, the imprisonment rate declined. Then in the Second World War, with the passage of national emergency manpower regulations, when Māori began to be moved into the cities to provide labour in the essential wartime industries, in the beginning of what some people call the urban drift. But I prefer to call it an urban shift, because Māori did not just drift into the cities, they were shifted because of politico-economic policies. Then after the war, that exacerbated with the taking of more Māori land, which is catalogued and research done on Town and Country Planning Act, the Public Works Act and so on. Māori were moved more into the cities to provide labour in the burgeoning manufacturing industries. And as greater contact occurred between Māori and others, then three things happened. Closed adoptions of Māori children were introduced. The first tranche of Māori children being taken into care occurred, and the rate of imprisonment of Māori began to rise. And those first generation of largely Māori boys who were taken from their family and placed in care in the 1950s were pipelined through to become the burgeoning Māori male imprisonment rate in the 60s and 70s. And so those statistics are traceable, and then they begin to rise again with Māori women in the 1990s, and that coincides with the increasing number of Māori girls being taken into care in the 1970s and 80s.
So there is socio-economic policy of that period, and I'm talking 60s, 70s, 80s, that are causing a transmigration shift of Māori whānau from rural areas to urban communities. There's economic pressures. What's happening to the cultural identity of those whānau and cultural connections of those whānau, and were there any policies that impacted on their ability to retain that identity?
If I could perhaps just illustrate the answer with the latest criminal justice research we've done. Of the 600 Māori men and women we interviewed who are or were in prison, all of them were what would be called urban Māori. They were either shifted from their whānau, either shifted from their rural homelands into the cities, or they grew up in cities within their iwi, but with no access to land because the land in their iwi had been taken. Those who moved into the cities, the generation that moved were usually fluent in the reo, confident in their tikanga. The economic and social pressures, which I call the modern equivalent of colonising pressures, then made it really difficult to sustain those taonga, that integrity in the city environment. And because some of that generation had also been punished for speaking the reo, they chose not to hand it on to their children because the assimilative pressure was to learn English. And so in the 60s, 70s and 80s, you begin to see the marked decline of Māori language, for example, as a first language amongst the bulk of the younger generations.
So I'm puzzled by the fact we see the revival of kohanga reo. Activists like myself and many others committed to the revival of te reo Māori in urban and rural realities, and yet reading your evidence or listening to your evidence today, we see incarceration rates and the taking of children increasing at an exponential rate, notwithstanding that cultural revolution. Can you help me explain? And I want to limit it really to that period, 1988 to 1999.
There is now a growing cohort of prisoners and ex-prisoners who were children of kohanga reo and kura kaupapa, fluent in the language, confident again in their tikanga, as our generation hoped they would be. But that has not protected them from becoming pipelined into prison. Just as a number of the old people often say, well, people who were arrested in the 19th century for resisting colonisation were absolutely fluent in the reo, absolutely confident in the tikanga. So that is why I think it's important to look at other colonising countries like Canada, Australia and the United States and say, well, what is it about those societies, what is it about their histories, which makes it more likely that Indigenous peoples will be imprisoned, whether they are secure in their tikanga or not?
My last question is, your report in 1988, like the report that Ms Green took us to and the other report you've taken to us, all talked about children being placed in the sphere of influence where Māori had control in tino rangatiratanga over the decision-making of tamariki mokopuna rangatahi. Notwithstanding those recommendations in 1988, what have been the barriers to achieving that transformational change that certainly you and many other Māori leaders of that time, Sir John Rangiho, Dame Mirasazi, the late Bishop Bennett, Bishop Virko, they were all part of that vanguard. What were the barriers to achieving their aspirations?
It is essentially the unwillingness of the Crown to acknowledge the relationship which was actually entered into in Te Tiriti o Waitangi. It is an unwillingness of the Crown to have the imagination to imagine the justice of the relationship. It's been an unwillingness to acknowledge that if Māori are able to exercise Māori authority in a Māori sphere of influence, this country will not slide into the sea. And that's part of a process of the treaty journey, which we are still on. In the Constitutional Transformation Report, we recommended 2040, 200 years after the signing of the treaty, as a good point to envision a treaty-based constitutional relationship. And I think it may take that time to encourage the conversation, the social conversation which is needed for that to occur. But the barrier has been the Crown unwillingness to listen to Māori concerns.
And I suggest to share power has also been a major barrier, particularly in the context of what you also mentioned in your brief, the desire now for Māori to design their own systems and to implement those systems with appropriate resources.
Well, one of the currently popular Crown terms at the moment is co-design, which rather like the relationship agreements that are being entered into between some iwi and oranga tamariki. Sounds good in theory, but in practice you are co-designing a relationship where the Crown retains absolute power. And so that's not an equal tiriti-based co-design. Whereas a tiriti-based process of constitutional transformation will help deliver that, I think.
Can't thank you enough for your evidence.
Kia ora.
Thank you so much, Moana. Kia ora.
Thank you, Ms Sykes. Are there any other council who wish to address questions to Dr Jackson? There aren't. Colleagues. Dr Tiriti?
Tēnā koe he te rangatira, e mihi nui ki a koe. Dr. Jackson, if I could ask you, as a long-standing champion of international Indigenous rights, a few questions, firstly about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It'd be useful to know, I think, the reasons why Māori and other Indigenous peoples journeyed all the way to Geneva in the 1980s to draft an international instrument on Indigenous rights, particularly given that there were the two international human rights covenants that have been in place for some time. Could you give us a reason for that mahi?
Happy to do that. There is a whakapapa. In 1923, a delegation of rangatira, frustrated at the inability to meet with the Crown in the person of the monarch in London, heard about a new international organisation that had been established after the First World War called the League of Nations in Geneva. And so a group of rangatira travelled to Geneva in 1923 to petition the League of Nations about the grievances of our people, and they were refused admission because the New Zealand government had informed the other delegates that the League of Nations was a League of Nation States, and to quote the words, the native peoples waiting in the forecourt are not a nation. So those rangatira turned and sailed back home. One of them kept a diary, and on the day that they were declined admission, he wrote, "The halls of this palace are not yet ready to hear the voice of our people." 50 years later, in 1973, a group of Indigenous peoples, mainly from the Americas, travelled back to Geneva, which by then had become what had previously been the League of Nations, Palais de Justice, had become the human rights headquarters of the new United Nations. And they travelled with the same hopes as the Māori delegation. And they too were declined admission. But every year after that, they returned, asking for a place where their voice could be heard. And eventually, at the instigation of a number of Scandinavian governments, Norway, Sweden, and so on, enough state support was gathered to establish within the United Nations a working group on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And because my grandfather had been one of the rangatira who travelled to Geneva in 1923, I was asked to be one of the Māori delegation that went to the first meeting of the working group in 1988. And we there drafted 2 agenda items for the working group. One was that there would be an international study of Indigenous treaties. And the second was that work would begin on drafting a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples, because there was no extant or distinct document of fundamental human rights pertaining to Indigenous peoples. There were discrete conventions being developed, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention Against Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and so on. And so we thought it was important that there should be an international set of minimum human rights standards for Indigenous peoples. We also thought it was important because, as I alluded to in my brief in talking about the Veo Delith debates, colonisation was predicated on the less than full humanity of Indigenous peoples. And we felt that if there was a distinct statement of Indigenous human rights, it was one way of restoring the full humanity of Indigenous peoples. And so that was the consensus thinking, I guess, which led to the actual drafting.
So they are human rights, but they are adapted and fit so that they are specific to Indigenous peoples around the world. Is that right?
Well, I can perhaps illustrate that best if it's helpful by referring to Article 3 of the Declaration, which is the right of self-determination. The major human rights conventions, the Convention on Civil and Political Rights and so on, have statements on self-determination. They say all peoples have the right of self-determination. And so what we did in the drafting of the Declaration, we took that article and just inserted Indigenous so that in the Declaration it reads all Indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination. And then the rest of the article articulates what that right is. But again, it was to recover that full humanity, that peoplehood, if you like, of Indigenous peoples around the world.
Dr. Jackson, you mentioned the right to self-determination in your brief of evidence and emphasised that. Are there other rights in the Declaration that you think are also important to this kaupapa?
If I can just contextualise that again, yes, there are. The drafting of the inclusion of Article 3 in the Declaration was regarded as crucial by Indigenous peoples because it's from that seminal right that all other rights flow. So you can't have a right, for example, to education in your own language, which is another article in the Declaration, unless you have the right to self-determine what that education should be. And so you can't have an effective right, say, the rights of Indigenous women, of Indigenous children, of Indigenous old people and so on, which are also included in Declaration, without that right of self-determination because they are dependent upon the ability of Indigenous peoples to determine for themselves what those rights are. And so there are a number of distinct articles which I'm sure members of the Commission will be aware of, which relate to the well-being of children and so on, and they flow from Article 3 in my view.
Kia ora. Dr. Jackson, you note also that when the Declaration was finally endorsed by the New Zealand government several years after it was endorsed by the UN General Assembly, that there were a number of reservations that the state made against the Declaration. In your view, why was New Zealand so opposed to the Declaration and in particular the right to self-determination?
I mentioned in my brief the work we've done in the criminal justice research on Canada, Australia, the United States and New Zealand, what are called the settler colonial states, and they all opposed Article 3. They all opposed the right of self-determination being included. And their arguments were that when the program of decolonisation began after the Second World War, the right of self-determination was articulated as part of the right of peoples who had been colonised to be independent again in their own countries. So the great independence struggles in Africa and Asia and so on. The settler state governments, New Zealand, Australia and so on, sought to limit the right of self-determination, to exclude Indigenous peoples in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States. And they did that by inventing a doctrine called the Blue Water Doctrine, which said that the only peoples who are entitled to self-determination are those whose colonies are across a stretch of blue water from the governing authority. So Kenya was entitled, the people of Kenya were entitled under that configuration to self-determination because the metropole government was in London across a stretch of water. Māori, Indigenous peoples in Canada and so on, under that configuration were not entitled to self-determination because the government in those countries was not across a stretch of water. The settlers there did not go home, they came to stay. And so that rather fatuous distinction of a blue water colony was created. And so when Indigenous peoples began to talk about all peoples being entitled to self-determination, they resurfaced the blue water thesis. And when the vote was taken to ratify the declaration in the General Assembly, as you will know, only 4 countries opposed it, and those 4 countries were New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and the United States. When they subsequently acceded to the declaration, they placed a number of reservations on it, including reservations on the right of self-determination.
So it was fundamentally the human right to equality, the basis for demanding the right to self-determination for Indigenous peoples, as with other peoples around the globe.
Well, if we say that Indigenous peoples, say Māori people in this country, do not have the full right of self-determination, then we're actually saying that Māori are not fully human. We are not walking away from the dreadful legacy of colonisation. We are embedding the power structures within that legacy. And so either you have human rights because you are fully human, or you don't have them because you're not fully human. And the whole basis of the human rights discourse is that, as the United Nations Declaration says, all humans are born alike in freedom and dignity. It doesn't say some humans, it says all humans. And that's the basis on which the declaration was drafted, and I think it's the basis on which Te Tiriti o Waitangi should be understood.
You just mentioned Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and I just wonder if we could shift to also consider if we have the declaration, He Whakaputunga and Te Tiriti, about their relationship to one another. Are they mutually reinforcing? Are they slightly different in some way?
Well, they're all about the full humanity of people. When our tipuna sought a relationship with the Crown, we had no concept that these people coming here were other than human. We recognised they were different. The term we've used in kahungunu has never been Pākehā. We've used the term rereke. They were different, but they were human. There was never any presumption of otherwise, that in their own way they had whakapapa, they were mokopuna. Colonisation created a situation in which Māori were not seen in the same way, and that's been the basis on which the Crown has interpreted the treaty, that it is some superior humanoid creation which can rule over Māori, and that's not the basis for an interdependent conciliatory relationship, I don't believe. And so Te Tiriti, the declaration, He Whakaputanga, to me, are part of the overall constitutional framework, which gives us an opportunity to be something quite unique in this country and create something which will, I think, help prevent the abuse that this Commission is tasked with dealing.
Kia ora taku to Jackson. I note also that your tikanga-based construction of Te Tiriti is a long-standing one from memory. And is a long-standing construction that you've had, and well before the He Whakaputunga Tribunal report. Is that correct?
The notion that is fundamental to that treaty, and I talk about that treaty as the English words favoured by the Crown, is that Māori would do something which iwi had never done. There is nothing in Māori history where, say, tūhoi would voluntarily give away tūhoi decision-making authority to Ngā Tika Haumanu. It's not a Māori reality. I actually don't think it's a human reality. I'm not aware of anywhere, say, in European history, where the King of England woke up one day and said, I'm going to give all the authority-making power that I have to the Emperor of France. It's just not a human reality. And so the notion that we would not have given away our authority, but sought an equitable, interdependent relationship with these new people is indeed a long-standing tikanga understanding, I think.
Kia ora. And just finally, it's good to see that the legal historians have caught up with your construction this time. So rather than piecemeal reforms at the bottom, if you like, the solution is what a starting point for Matiki Mai. The model is for fundamental reform at a constitutional level, reflecting those relative spheres of influence, tino rangatiratanga, and another sphere of influence for the Crown. And clearly, tamariki Māori fit within the rangatira sphere. So does it follow that, from this model, that in the Crown sphere of influence, that it's confined to non-Māori Pākehā children?
But because our people in the constitutional transformation process talked mainly about values rather than constitutional models, they wanted constitutional transformation but talked more about the values which should underpin it, which is why the tribunal finding about spheres of influence was really helpful, because it enabled us to frame models. And so the sort of models we looked at, and there are several in the report, were the two spheres, if you like, the rangatiratanga sphere, the kāwanatanga sphere, and then what we called a relational sphere, where we would come together within the treaty relationship to make joint decisions about matters of common interest. But some issues are so values-based within tikanga, for example, such as looking after mokopuna, that would clearly be within the rangatiratanga sphere. But they would not be isolated spheres, because we share this country because of Te Tiriti.
Kia ora.
Colleagues?
No questions from me, thank you.
Colleagues? Mr. Gibson.
E te rangatira Takara Jackson, tina koe. If I'm understanding you right and appreciating the power, the wisdom, the maturanga behind what you say, we may make some progress in the short term with values with tikanga-based frameworks, but to sustain what we are striving to around abuse and care for tamariki mokopung and young people, vulnerable adults, ultimately we need to sustain some kind of constitutional transformation, which, if I'm understanding right, falls out of Te Tiriti as opposed to Te Tiriti falling out of the Constitution. And alongside that, talk about the various international human rights instruments. Is there a tension between the UNCROC, the United Nations Commission on the Rights of the Child, and the paramountcy of the child, perhaps the individual, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, with more of a collective rights focus? Is there a tension, or is there a misinterpretation and misrepresentation about what can be achieved together with the two of them?
No, I think the tension exists because people misinterpret the notion of collectivity in tikanga. The interests of the child are paramount in tikanga, but they're paramount within a collective. You cannot isolate the child from the whakapapa to which he or she belongs. So to talk about the paramountcy of the child is to talk about the paramountcy of the whakapapa to which he or she belongs. There's not a tension there. The tension arises because under the individuated notion that permeates, say, the oranga tamariki legislation and so on, it actually isolates the child, whether the child is Māori or Pākehā or whatever. It's the interests of that individual child which are paramount. And in tikanga, that's a contradiction in terms. The child is paramount within the whakapapa to which they belong.
Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. The Royal Commission has been the beneficiary of your remarkable clarity of expression. Mr. Merrick, I think we should conclude the day. Madam Registrar, will you connect us with Ngāti Whātua?
If everyone would please stand, and we'll end the day with our karakia e Waitangi.
Te maanga e ngāna hira pono te toko toru I tapu. Whakaungia mātou ki roto I te aroha noa. Pai here te ano mātou ki te rangi Māori I ngā wā katoa. Te maanga e hei tau toko mai. Ai anei, ākene, ai. Kia ora.
E tēnei, nohoanga, the sitting is adjourned.